Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our, I'm not sure what number this is, our small church webinar, our last small church webinar in this series of webinars to explore how we can broaden and deepen the ministry of our small churches in New Hope Presbytery. It's good to be with you all. I'm going to open us with prayer and then introduce our guest speaker. So let us pray. Eternal God, we thank you for the gift of your church and for the privilege that we have to be a part of it. We thank you for your faithful servants in churches of every size, all those who seek to do your will and serve your purpose in our world. We ask your blessing upon this particular group of saints this evening, that we might understand better how you are calling us to step out and be more faithful in our communities and throughout our world, so that your love might be more known in our world. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Our guest this evening for our webinar is John Dempsey Parker. John works with the Institute for Emerging Issues at North Carolina State, and is going to talk with us this evening about asset-based community mapping. And I think assets and mapping make it sound like it's a very financial topic, but it is not. And I'm going to let him say more about it. I've just recently been introduced to him. I know a little bit about his work and this particular work, and I'm really, but as I've gotten to know him a little bit, I'm really excited about the things that he's going to speak with us about tonight. And I think you will be too. So, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andy. Hey, everybody. It's good to see you all. Yeah, I'm John Parker, and what I thought I would do tonight is, in addition to, I'll introduce myself in just a little bit, and I'd love to hear where y'all are calling in from, because context is everything in this topic and this work. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background as it relates to my relationship with asset-based community development and asset mapping. And really, just so you know, I'm not going to have a PowerPoint tonight, because I think these kind of conversations are best to be had just looking at each other. I will have some resources that I will share after the webinar is over. I have some things that I would share regardless, and then based on our discussion, I might add to that or curate it a little differently, depending on how we talk about it. I'm going to present for a little while, or share, I guess I should say, I will be sharing my story for a little while, and then stop for questions and dialogue, and then may pick up a little bit more. And what I share in sort of the second half is going to depend on kind of your interests, your questions, and kind of what we talk about as a group. So that's kind of how we're going to flow tonight. But I'm going to actually share my introduction first, because I have found that sometimes sharing a story and an introduction first might actually help shape how you introduce yourselves when it's your turn, rather than getting name, rank, and serial number. Then you might actually share a little bit more about yourselves. And since we're a smaller group, maybe we can talk a little bit more about kind of what your work is in your congregation and in your parish, and hear a little bit about the purposes and the reason why you're here tonight, whether it's to get a refresher of something that you already know, or to go a little bit deeper. So I'll share that I'm from Moore County originally, about an hour south of Raleigh. About 4 generations, both sides from Moore County. All of my cousins still live in Moore County, except for 3 of them. And one of them made it as far as Hillsborough, and the other 2 are in Wake County with me, and one lives not too far down the road. I've lived in Raleigh for almost a little over 20 years. Before then, I was in Greensboro. And I guess I'll start by saying that, you know, in Moore County, I grew up in a pretty large extended family, but our family actually owned a hardware store. And so when I think about asset mapping, I think about the fact that I think about it a little bit from that hardware store perspective. And so really my first job was working in the family hardware store. And I was also first generation college. And we made the decision to, after 25 years of having the hardware store, we ended up selling the hardware store as a way to finance my college education. And I went to Wake Forest for undergrad, and went to graduate school the first time at Memphis State. And it was at Memphis State and in my time in Memphis when I actually learned about asset-based community development. And I'll come back to Memphis in just a minute. But after that program in Memphis, I had always intentionally come back to North Carolina because even though I have a huge extended family, I don't have any siblings. And so it was I felt like it was my responsibility to be able to take care of my parents as they got older. And so I came back to North Carolina to work. And I've had a variety of jobs in the community development space in North Carolina, which I can talk about in a little bit. And then when and then I did go to graduate school for the second time at Duke to get a master's of divinity. So I have gone to seminary, but I went when I was, what I would call mid-career, because I was reflecting on my history and really felt like when I thought about who I've really enjoyed working with in the community development space, I'd always really enjoyed working with clergy and laity that were highly involved in their community. And so rather than just having church be something that was extracurricular, I decided I wanted to take a 20-something year community development career and flip it for the purposes of the church. So I was facilitating a board meeting for the North Carolina Council of Churches earlier this week, and it was funny. The pastor who introduced me, I've actually known since 1997, and he described me as a young man, and when you've known someone that long, they might think of you as the person you were when you first met. And I let people know because we were on Zoom, of course, that my youngest child, who's 13, was really convinced that I was going to turn 50 this year. And I said, son, 49, give me that extra year. And so when you think about how long it's been that you've been doing things, it's just interesting. So I went to Duke back in 2012. And finished in 2015, and have been working at NC State since then in this program that's called Rural Faith Communities as Anchor Institutions. It's a little bit of a clunky name. I inherited that name, but we just call ourselves the Faith and Community Team at NC State, and it's a program embedded in North Carolina's Institute for Emerging Issues. We are supported largely by the Duke Endowment since 2015. And I've been lucky enough to be working with a small team of people that have been basically resourcing faith communities all around the state to really help them walk alongside the ministries they want to do in community. And so, yeah, Nancy asked a question. Yeah, I will. It's called the Rural Faith Communities as Anchor Institutions. And so some people know about it, and I just put the acronym in the chat as RFCAI, which tells you nothing. But that's really the acronym for it. We call ourselves the faith team or the faith and community team. And sometimes we'll call ourselves the Faith and Community Initiative at the Institute for Emerging Issues. which has been a think tank, or a think and do tank, as they like to describe themselves, for 35 years, that was originally started by Governor Jim Hunt back in the day. And but again, our work has really been to consult, coach, support, and brainstorm with clergy and laity about how to be more active in their communities in ways that they want to be. So generally what we think about is our work is capacity building. And so as we're going to be doing tonight, we get to know you, get to know a little bit about your context, what it is that you're doing and want to be doing. And we try to either help think about strategies to help you meet your goals, whether that's to start a health ministry, whether that's to start a community food project, whether that's to actually build relationships across denominational, cultural, racial, or class lines, or maybe you've got an idea for renovating a building or starting an affordable housing project, or even starting a different worship service outside the walls of your building. We really want to be thoughtful about how to be of assistance to you in that work. And so that's a little bit about me. There's a lot more to it, and I guess I would just say that I'm open to any kind of questions. So any questions, large or small, is a game for me. But before I go further, I actually want to share a meditation to sort of get us in the right spirit. And then I'll share a little bit about my background in asset-based community development specifically. And then I want to hear a little bit about where y'all are from and your context and maybe some questions that you have. And then I'll pick up the discussion in a little bit more. But now just here's a meditation that I think sometimes is helpful in grounding the spirit of this kind of work. Let's remember that every one of us here is a teacher and a learner. None of us have it all figured out. Let's keep our minds and hearts open with humility and curiosity. Let's speak from the heart. Let's listen wholeheartedly without judgment. And let's make room for others in this space. Today, my preference is that we cultivate what has heart, nurtures creativity, imagination, fruitfulness, and greater wholeness. And finally, let's remember that it is truly a gift that we actually have this time together. So, we're having, I'm thankful for Zoom just because we're all living in different places and we don't have to drive in to Raleigh to actually have this discussion. And so that's been an advantage of this kind of platform. But of course, we aren't in the same room together. And largely that's because of the pandemic. I would like to believe that as things evolve, hopefully later this year, and that we're able to spend more time with each other, we can still use this platform in ways where we can still learn across the presbytery or across the state about what each other is doing. But I am really, I'm sorry that I can't see what kind of shoes you're wearing. But if you want to show me later, you can, by either taking a shoe off and holding it up to the screen, or if you're really flexible, you can just hold your foot up, and then we'll know about a little more about each other, at least in that particular way. Oh, here we go. Yeah, there you go. Excellent. Thank you. That's really good, John. Appreciate it. Well, so it is funny, my introduction to asset-based community development was actually from what I would call the source. This particular paradigm was created, unfortunately, in Chicago in the early 90s by a couple of sociologists, John McKnight and John Kritzman, who were based in the Northwestern Public Policy Institute. And they created a book that is finally referred to as the Green Book in 1993 that talked about asset-based community development and this process of asset mapping. They sort of, they wrote it up. And like a lot of people that live and work in Chicago, they sort of had Chicago as the world. So they had a really strong urban perspective about how to actually do this work. I got to know them because when I was in graduate school the first time, getting a master's degree in applied cultural anthropology, I was doing an internship at the local community foundation. And my job was to actually work with neighborhood organizations and help them actually with the projects that they wanted to do in their neighborhood, whether that was a beautification project or a youth development project or affordable housing. My job was to listen to their ideas and to help them structure their ideas into some sort of work plan that was actionable. And the foundation was learning from these good folks in Chicago, about how to turn the grant making process at the foundation from a needs-based approach to a strengths-based approach. So we were the first community foundation in the country to actually change, and this was 1995, to change our grant making process from a needs-based approach to a strengths-based approach. So rather than asking the question, what are the needs of the project that you're wanting to get some support for? What are the problems in your community? We flipped it and said, how do you define community? And so for some people, it was a geographic sort of neighborhood bounded by streets. Other people, it was more relational and it was defined by a certain constituency, whether that was African-American youth or elderly or folks that were interested in a particular hobby, whatever that happened to be. Again, more geographical or more relational. So our first question out the get-go was like, how do you define community? Well, instead of asking about the needs and we're asking about community, we would say, well, what's the project that you're proposing and how is the project that you're proposing going to strengthen the community? So rather than actually fixing a problem, we were talking about how do we actually strengthen the community? And then after hearing about how things were going to be strengthened, we also just asked the question of what are the indicators that you know that the community is going to be strengthened? So that's sort of getting at outputs and outcomes. But it wasn't about fixing the problem necessarily. Indirectly it was, but it wasn't specifically about fixing a particular problem. And then we asked a number of questions around leadership development, because in addition to building community, we felt that in terms of looking at the resilience and the sustainability of the organization or of the neighborhood or of the project, we were asking questions about, well, how are things going to be different through this process of doing this work? So the assumptions behind all of that were basically the three principles of asset-based community development and this process of asset mapping, which I think as Andy sort of implied, y'all might be really familiar with the basics, which is, and be doing some of this work, but that the number one principle is that in addition to the fact that we're all needy, right? Like we've all got needs and we've all got issues. Every one of us on this Zoom, believe it or not, has issues. And, but in addition to that, we're all gifted, right? We've all got strengths. We've all got talents. We've got skills. The way that I like to break this down is I get really kindergarten about it. And I sort of just say, we've all got gifts of the head, heart, and hands. We've all got gifts of the heart. We care about stuff. We've all got gifts of the hands. We can do things. And we've all got gifts of the head. We know stuff. The reality of it is they're not gifts unless they're given. So what are the things that we know well enough that we can teach somebody else? What are the things we can do well enough that we can teach somebody else? And what is it that we care about enough that we just wake up in the morning and just want to talk about that with other folks? Um, so again, the number one thing is that we're all gifted and that we've all got strengths regardless of whatever issues or needs we might have. The second issue is, or the second principle of asset-based community development, is that it's an inside-out approach. Well, it was really funny to me coming from a rural community in North Carolina. I'm listening to these urban sociologists talk about an inside-out approach, and they were talking about it from the perspective that it's hard to ask for help, or it's hard to ask for help in the right way if you don't know your strengths, if you don't know who you are and what you're about and your purpose. It's difficult to ask for help if you're not sure where you're coming from. Well, it also works that way from a neighborhood. If a neighborhood's going to ask City Hall or the mayor for assistance, the first thing City Hall or the mayor is going to say, well, what have you all done about it, this issue that you're dealing with, that you're asking for help from? So this idea of getting organized before you ask for assistance. Well, my first thing was like, this inside out approach seems inherently theological, right? It's like, it's about that it starts from within, and then that's kind of where the growth can come from. And so even though they were talking about it from a secular sociological standpoint, I think it's really easy for clergy, laity, anybody that's coming from a strong sense of values and goodwill, any person of faith is going to think about this inside out approach as making sense and aligned with where they are, because it feels inherently spiritual. The third thing, which is also inherently theological, if we think about it that way, is that it's all based on relationships. So taken all together, we've all got strengths and gifts. It's an inside out approach, and it's all based on relationships. Now, that's really the sort of the foundation of the approach. And what we're here to talk about tonight is this issue of mapping your assets, mapping your gifts. And I would just simply say, after working this approach for a couple of decades, that the main thing to remember is that it really matters what your purpose is in doing this mapping. It really matters why you want to do this. And it also matters kind of like what you think the end goal might be. And I guess I would also say that this process also can be never ending. You can always come back to it because things are always changing. You're always going to have new people in your community. You're always going to be meeting new people. If you're mapping the gifts and talents of the people that your church, that's going to change over time. Not only are the people going to change, but people are going to learn and grow as they get older, and they're going to pick up new skills and talents as they go along. They also are going to have different interests. And so this idea of mapping the skills and assets really can be something that can be done on an annual basis, a seasonal basis, and it actually does matter about the depth of how you want to go with this, because I think we all know sometimes it takes a while to get to know someone, and the level of trust and intimacy that is needed to really get to know someone's gifts is different than finding out some of the surface things about people. So that's sort of where I was coming from in terms of when I learned about it. And coming from a rural community, this also seemed pretty common sense to me. Because this is just kind of how I felt like I grew up, right? It was really about how do people come together. You figure out what you have. You're not necessarily looking for help or assistance from Raleigh or Washington, D.C. or whatnot. You're sort of figuring it out from a local perspective. And you're kind of, the way I thought about it is you sort of make do with what you got. Now, that might not be the most abundant perspective, but in a lot of communities, that's kind of how where folks are coming from. You make do with what you got, and you work with what you have. And there's nothing wrong with that approach as a starting point. And I would also really encourage that. So I'm gonna take a pause for just a minute and just kind of hear. Would love it if y'all would introduce yourselves. I would love to know who you are, kind of where you're calling from, and kind of your role in your community. I don't want to assume that everyone here is clergy. Some of y'all might be super laity. And also I'd like to hear a little bit about the reason kind of why you're here tonight. You know, is there a project that you're thinking about? Is there something that you are working on that you kind of want to me to sort of, or that we can all speak to? And then if you're sitting with any questions, not just about what I've talked about already, but maybe you've had an experience that you have some learnings or questions that you want to bring forward at this point, and I can either weave an answer into the next part of the talk or address it more specifically. And I guess I would just say that any question is a good question, because if you speak that question, someone else might have that question and don't know that they have it. You know what I mean? So if it's all right with y'all, I'm gonna say who I see closest to me in the boxes. And then after they introduce themselves, I'm gonna let them pick who gets to go next, because that'll make it fun. And so, Mary, I would love it if you would say hey to us first and introduce yourself, and if you've got any hot topics or questions that you'd like for us to talk about tonight.
Well, I'm Mary Todd, and I'm the pastor of the Morton Presbyterian Church, which is a tiny church outside of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, in a rural setting. And I appreciated your talking about growing up rural, because I did too. I grew up on a dairy farm, and my roots are still there, and my brother is still there, although he's not milking cows anymore. But we grew up in a tiny church that raised us well. And so well, I could write a book about the church I grew up in with a title like All I Know About Ministry I Learned from the Kirk. It's a fine, fine church, and my brother's an elder there now. The Morton Church, on Sunday, I see 15, 20, 25 people. And I have been working with the same group of people for 31 years. And this is such a beautiful congregation full of gifts. These people really love Jesus. There are no hangers on. They're people that are serious about being Christ followers. And they have big, big hearts. One of the things they have a heart for is children. And right now we have several children under our wings, but we just have one that's there every Sunday. But it's a baby whose mama understands why being with us will have a big impact on that little girl. Where we are right now, well, we were talking a lot about neighboring in neighborhoods when COVID hit, Then we went into hibernation. And so we're all feeling kind of slow and rusty, or maybe still sleepy from hibernation.
Mm.
And wondering, okay, how do we get going again in taking this lovely light into the community?
Mm.
One thing that has happened during COVID, a family has moved across the road from the church, and they are going to build a gym over there for that will serve all children, including children with special needs.
Mm.
So we've got our little flock over here that loves children
Mm-hmm.
and nourishes them any way we can. And we've got these new neighbors that they're so dedicated to this. They're living in an RV
Mm.
to save money to help them. And so right now, what I'm focusing on is, okay, I don't know what we're going to do post-COVID, but we can at least make friends with our new neighbors across the street.
Right.
And, tell them how much we appreciate what they're doing, what their dream is.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we'll get to share some of our dream of finding ways to raise up strong children.
Yep.
So hope I didn't take too long, but anyway, yeah, that's what I wake up thinking about in the mornings.
No, that's great. Thank you, Mary. And I'd love to hear where everybody is and what everybody's doing before I speak to any particular person's things. But thank you, Mary. That was beautiful. Mary, who do you want to go next?
Well, how about Candy?
I had to find my unmute button.
It's always there somewhere. You just got to.
It is. And sometimes you find it in the most unlikely spot. But I found it quickly this evening. I'm Candy White, and I am the stated supply pastor at Warrenton Presbyterian Church. And we are a very small congregation. We have 8 members. But we are a presence. We do have a presence in the community. And I think that our thrust has been and continues to be to work on an ecumenical basis within the community. If you put all of the downtown churches in Warrenton together, we would have a really good congregation. But that's not going to happen, and that's okay. That's okay. But we are currently working on a project, and it, as Mary said, it involves children, and it really has taken off. It's based on the Backpack Buddies program, and we're calling it Blessings in a Bag. It is a faith-based community project. It just happens to be stationed at Warrenton Presbyterian Church. It belongs to the entire community, though. We are preparing backpacks for 35 children each week at a local elementary school, and the interest and the support for this has exploded. It is absolutely unbelievable how quickly this has caught on. So we want to continue to fan that flame, and we've even got interest in another school in another small community, and we're trying to get some business and churches in that area also involved in this type of ministry. I think that the biggest thing and the main reason I'm here this evening is when you live in a small community, and it's you see the color of my hair, it's gray. In an aging community, there are 800 people in Warrenton, North Carolina. you want to max out on every single solitary person that is available, so that we don't duplicate effort, and that we work toward building relationships, writing new stories, and just living together as I think that Christ would have us live. So that's my story, and I'm open for any suggestions about how to maximize the potential and the numbers that are here.
That's great. And what's the other community that you were referencing? Is it?
It's actually Norlina.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, a buddy of mine's a pastor in Norlina. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No. No, that's great. I was curious if it was when you mentioned it, because I was just talking with him about some work that he was doing up.
Yeah.
Up
Yeah.
that way. That's great, Candy. Who do you want to go next? And don't pick John, because I think he left us briefly.
I won't. I'm going to pick Jane.
Unmute. I'm Jane King. I'm a member of First Presbyterian in Henderson, not very far from Candy.
Right.
And I am this year the co-moderator of the Church Development and Evangelism Committee. And we have started a sub-team or subcommittee to look at some sort of initiative to help churches be more. We looked at vital congregations. And then from our committee, I said I would attend this and learn more. Our church also does a lot of different things like soup kitchen and no interest loan ministry, a tiny pantry, but we're always trying to figure out what we need to do to be more of service.
Mhm.
But in addition to that, I am very much involved with Community Partners of Hope in Henderson, which operates our emergency men's shelter and a transitional house called Hope House.
Mhm.
And we've been in operation for 12 or 13 years now, and we are experiencing some growing pains. And the things you started talking about, I was like, that's what we need to be doing. We try, our name is indicative of our goal to be community partners. And that doesn't always work out. Other organizations are kind of like territorial about their stuff, but we're making good progress. So in a nutshell, that's me. And I can't show you my shoes because I don't have any on.
That's fantastic. And so I hope everybody's barefoot. There you go. That's great. Thanks, Katie. I hope that's good, Mary. I hope everybody's either got comfortable shoes on or that they're barefoot, because it's starting to warm up out there. Even though it's still sometimes getting a little cool at night.
Yeah.
Well, who's going to go next? I think that we lost we lost somebody in the
Yeah, we lost. Yeah. How about John?
Okay.
John, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay.
You're good to go.
Okay. Okay. We're talking now.
You're doing great.
Well, I'm really tempted to show you the bright and bold socks that go with my shoes, but we'll have to wait till next week.
Okay.
And once you see it, you realize what a treat you missed.
Well, the presence of the Lord is now and not yet, and so we'll have to put the socks in the not yet category.
Your loss. Anyway, I'm a third generation pharmacist. And I was blessed to have parents that in the 1930s were both college graduates.
Hmm.
That was a rarity
Mhm.
then and now. One thing they both bought into was there's nothing that can't be improved. And in their different ways, we three brothers were raised by parents who believed in leaven, the chemical term, a catalyst. You change other things without giving away your own integrity,
Mhm.
so forth. And for me, that takes the form of being very much interdisciplinary, meaning I like the metaphor from years ago about being a person for all seasons. You welcome diverse backgrounds, talents, attitudes, whatever. I mean, we even welcome Andy James when he gets out of Raleigh and has sense enough to come down here to the 51st state. And for those of you who don't know what the 51st state is, that's northeast of North Carolina, east of the Chowan River and the Albemarle Sound. And on a clear day, we can see Big Bend and tell what time it is until the last 48 hours where the Russians messed up the air, but that's another story. But the point I'm doing with that reference is I think there are real opportunities, and in different ways, some of us have tried to say, look, why not look at the current tragedy in the Ukraine as a way for the church at large to think seriously and to speak in depth about evil, cosmic evil, big time bad stuff.
Mhm.
And therefore the question, what does the gospel, what does the Reformation faith have to say from cosmic evil, such as we're seeing in our day and time right now? No ifs, ands, or buts. We've all probably done our psychoanalysis of Putin, and we end up with a stalemate of what does it take to stop this thing without all of us getting shot? But furthermore, how do we keep mentally alive and perceptive as people of faith, trying to say, okay, I didn't bargain for this,
Mhm.
but surely God has not abandoned his creation.
Mhm.
It's just time to listen. Yes. Time to confess shortcomings. Yes. Time to reach out to others in the community. Yes. Time to listen more. I've always loved the quote from Winston Churchill. He says, it takes courage to stand up and speak, but it takes even more courage to sit down and listen. So, a minister who came to Albemarle Presbytery before we got absorbed into New Hope was out of Texas. And the way he always introduced his sermons when he was a visiting fireman, he would say, listen now for the word of God to you. I've been doing a lot of listening in the last few days at a different level. And I'm hoping that some of you are smarter than I. And if not individually, then collectively, when we talked about our assets, present and future, how can we funnel these assets to this crisis of the spirit and of the real world
Mhm.
now before all of us? That's the end of my commercial. I'll show you my other shoe later.
Okay. Thanks, John. Nancy, I think you're up.
By default, I think. Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Warren. I am southeast of Raleigh in Johnston County at the White Memorial Presbyterian Church, not that other one, in Raleigh. So at any rate, I am here tonight because I'm kind of in the, I feel like I'm in the middle of something really happening at our church and have been for a while. I first heard about asset-based community development in a book that a group of us get together on Sunday mornings. We're called the Roundtable Group. And a few years, gosh, you kind of lost, 2 years ago today was the first case of COVID in North Carolina. So I'm thinking backwards now, and it scares me, the loss of the years. But we read a book called The Neighborhood Church. Yes, okay, good. And it made a lot of difference to us at that time. This was pre-COVID. And they talk about asset-based community development and asset mapping in this book. And it really was kind of a game changer for us. We have a community garden at our church. It's called the Let Us Feed You Community Garden. It started, I think this is our 4th year now. We raise produce specifically to provide fresh produce for the West Johnston High School food pantry. And that's been a partnership for many years with the West Johnston High School food pantry. Before COVID hit, we got a grant, a small church grant to renovate really our kitchen. We have a great fellowship hall. If you've ever been to White Memorial and been to it's a lovely fellowship hall, has great space, and our kitchen appliances all needed replacing because we were moving toward the concept of a community kitchen. And along that way too, I had been smitten with Kendall Vanderslice in Durham, who wrote a book called Now We Feast. I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's about dinner church. It's really about dinner church and about food. It's about worship, the importance of food and worship. But and so we were ready to open we got the small church grant, and we were full speed ahead. And then the pandemic hit, and we couldn't move on the whole notion of the community kitchen for the last 2 years. But now we are opening back up. But the community garden continued throughout the whole pandemic. We never missed a beat, and we were able to continue to supply the school even when the kids weren't coming to school. The teachers that facilitate the kids and the students in the pantry still were doing the weekly food, more important than ever, of course. And so at any rate, I am here tonight because last year we had our first ever neighborhood block party, and that was a lot of fun, and we got to meet a lot of our neighbors. Our church sits on what used to be a country road, but now it's on a road that just has housing developments. It's not so agricultural anymore out here about where we are. So at any rate, so I'm just here to we want to re-engage with our neighborhood. We have great relationships with the folks right around us, and we have events where our neighborhood comes to us. But one thing I heard on that webinar last week, Andy, that just has stuck with me the whole time, and that was about the vital congregations, and I can't get over it. He said, you know what, we say during COVID, the doors were open and we had to get out. And so that is really what, that's something that just stuck with me, because that whole notion of get out of the building. So we're getting ready to start our Lent study in the garden. We're getting ready to do a worship service like once a quarter in the garden, so that we make the garden and the property of the church, the out of doors, part of our worshiping community. And so I'm just here to learn and maybe take another step in another direction. I'm not a community organizer, but I am a social worker by training and by profession. So I like this kind of stuff. Stuff really speaks to me. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm pretty excited about it all.
No, I mean, that's great, Nancy. And I mean, all of you, I mean, the reality of it is like, it's kind of really important to understand how your community can best get their minds and hands around this, regardless of what you call it. I think the thing that I would encourage everybody to think about, just real simply, is that if you look for problems, you generally just keep finding problems. But if you are looking for assets and strengths and abundance, it's there. But I feel like that sometimes our culture, our larger culture, teaches us to think about problems as opposed to the things that are really great. Now, and I guess what I would also say, I think rural communities typically actually do think this way more naturally because they need to. There's a sense of, we might think about it as problem solving, but the reality of it is whether you're talking about an urban community or rural community, a lot of the issues are the same. They just, the statistics of the issues might be different, right? Because the amount of people involved are different. The issues are still there. So the same issues in Johnston County that exist in Wilmington, they're just different, right? But the reality of it is the solutions are usually locally based. And so the assets and the skills of the problem solvers, the leadership, the people who are going to rally around and do something, those talents are actually really particular to the people who are actually present. And so I just try to remind folks that it's like really important to ask as many questions as you can about the people that are engaged. And so one thing, an interesting mistake that ended up being really an important thing when I was working with a church out in Moxville, which is in Davie County out west of Winston-Salem. I was talking with them about asset-based community development. And I said, look, you probably have people in your community you've always wanted to interview and talk to. What is it that, who are those people that you just use this project as an excuse to call those folks up and say, whatever it is you want to do. Now, I asked them to really think about a question that would really get conversations started with their community members. And they picked a question that really wasn't my favorite, but it really worked for them. And it was, I held my tongue just to see how it would go. The question that they used as their starter question was, what keeps you up at night? That really wasn't my favorite question, but it really worked for them. And I said, okay, I'm gonna come back out here in 3 weeks. This was pre-COVID. I said, I'm gonna come back out here in 3 weeks. I want you to have interviewed 5 people that you've always wanted to interview and talk to them about what keeps you up at night, the issues in your community, and what are the things that they think would strengthen the community. So they were going to do that. Now, the mistake that I made was being more clear about my instructions. I was talking to their laity team and their pastor of 9 people. They each thought they were supposed to interview 5 people. So I came back 3 weeks later, and rather than them collectively having interviewed 5 people, they had interviewed 45 people. And it was amazing. The amount of data and information and people that they had stirred up in getting excited about the ministry of the church. They also were concerned about children. Now, this is what was interesting. They they were concerned about, they started with a middle school, they're now working with a middle school and a high school. They were concerned that the culture of their school community was focusing too much on athletics and not enough on what they would call the non-jocks or the non-athletics. So they were concerned that the scholarship and the studious kids were getting overlooked, and there was a lot of bullying that was happening in the school. And so they were really concerned about the health and well-being and the mental and emotional health of the kids that were being bullied. And so it was an interesting issue to sort of grapple with. And what they ended up gravitating towards once they did this interviews was they started a peer support group for the students within the school, so that students would have time and space to be with each other and strengthen each other based on what was going on in those kids' lives. Parents and faculty were invited to be a part of it, but the faculty and the parents could not run the group. The kids had to run the group. And so they really used a peer support model for the kids to actually learn about the skills, gifts, and talents of each other. So the students actually could support each other in being the best they could be. And then that also built some community for them, which then strengthened their collective spirit to really, in a sense, resist and push back this bullying culture that existed in the school. And it was so successful after a year or so, it replicated itself in the high school, which was nice to see. But what really, and then because of this, and so what they do, in addition to this programmatic piece, is that they've started, and a number of churches like them have done this, is they've created sort of an open table, if you will, once a month for people to come to the church and talk about the things they're involved in. And so what it does is it creates an agenda. They might have a speaker once a month that talks for maybe 15 minutes, but the reality of it is they spend most of the time talking with each other about good work happening in the community and how they can help each other. And the church actually ends up being a convener of the good work that's happening in the community, and they inspire each other and try to find ways to strengthen what each other is doing. And what that has done is, as you can imagine, it's not only strengthened relationships beyond the church and the community, but it's also strengthened relationships ecumenically across houses of worship, so that churches are learning what each other is doing, and they can share resources, whether that's a van or one church opened their doors, so to speak, to the cooperative extension, and they have a new farmers market in the parking lot of one of the churches, because the parking lot is gifted with a lot of trees. And so they have a lot of shade in their parking lot, which is very helpful for the people who are setting up for the farmers market. And it's in a different part of the county than where the other farmers market is. And so that was a way, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not a big fan of parking lots, but that's a good use of one. You know what I mean? Sometimes I think parking lots are a waste of space, but if you can figure out how to use it, and there's a church in Virginia, in Richmond, that actually has built a community garden in their parking lot. What they've done is, they built up the soil and raised garden beds in the actual parking lot. And so they've gotten rid of some of their parking spaces and replaced that with raised bed gardens, which is nice. Well, I just want to say, I can think of different people that I know in or near each of your communities that are doing good work, that it would be fun for y'all to meet and for them to meet y'all. But I'm not here to set y'all up on dates, but I could. It would be fun to do that. Jane, you mentioned the Community Partners of Hope. A friend of mine, John Hilbert, I think might have been involved. John? Yeah. You're on mute. I didn't, but.
John's wonderful. He was on our board when we first started. He's pretty much retired now, but
Yeah,
he's
right.
still a sounding board for me frequently.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, John's a good friend. We've been
Yeah.
friends for years, and
He lost Margaret.
no, I mean it was terrible. It was sudden.
Awful.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it was very sudden. He seems to be doing okay, but
Yeah.
but yeah, no, that and it was funny that when he told me about the men's group, he said that it was the most amazing group of men that came together to create that program, because it was cross race and cross faith, right?
We are cross faith and race. We have some churches that are strictly, women should stay quiet, and we've got churches that are led by women. We have, we even have a kind of, I don't know, Jewish Christian. They're not Seventh-day Adventists, but they worship on Saturday, and they're very involved with us too.
Right.
And the Muslim congregation has expressed some interest.
Yeah, and I mean, I just think that's amazing, because I mean, if anybody knows Henderson, there's tension there, right? And
Oh, yeah.
and yeah, and so yeah, and so the fact that happens in an environment that a lot of people would just probably not believe that would happen in Henderson, right?
Oh, we were told you can't do that in Vance County.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so, yeah,
Yes,
and
we
so
can.
it's good to meet you, because I've always wanted to. I've always been impressed with the story of that program, and the fact that that it's just, to me, it's just one of the highlights of that area. And again, just but and so, but to go, and I knew a gentleman, he's not there anymore, who was pastoring an AME church in Henderson, and he had a church that was mostly elderly folks in his congregation, but he was in a rough part of Henderson, and he's a young guy, and the first thing he did is he just walked the streets, and he made friends with a lot of the real neighbors of the church, and a lot of the young people, and none of them were going to church, right? The people he was meeting, but he was building relationships with them, to the point that he then had a service in the neighborhood, not in the church, but in the streets, and people were responding to it. And he was building relationships with people that did not have a relationship at that time with church or with Jesus. And he was very effective but I asked him, I said, are any of your members actually going with you on these sojourns out in the neighborhood? He goes, no, absolutely not. They're not. And it was almost as if he developed a second congregation in the streets, yeah, it's just
That's great.
well, and it's amazing when that's part of this asset mapping work, is to have a vision for what can be, and to have a vision about what kind of questions do you want to ask when you're building relationships, even with your members, or with people beyond the membership. Mary, I'm real struck with your orientation of talking about how to break through the sleepiness. And I don't know, I know everybody's in a different place in terms of the coming back together part of this, but one thing that I've seen that can be helpful for folks who could be pre-COVID or during COVID is trying to figure out ways to have church together, even if you're at home. And one thing that I've had number of people do is that for folks who felt comfortable having certain people over at their house, is to actually have these conversations around what is it that you think we ought to be doing that would strengthen the church? What do you think we ought to be doing that can strengthen the community, and have it around the dinner table? I love dinner church because of the fact that how many stories are there in the Bible about eating and being together around food? It's like, that you can really relate the scripture to the ministry, to discipleship right around the dinner table. And churches have always done it, but I feel like sometimes they're on autopilot, like it's done ritualistically, but not done in a way where they're really having the conversations they need to be having. It ends up being more social than an exercise of discipleship. And I really think that now is one of those times. We're still living in the pandemic. We're still living through multiple pandemics. This thing, this war that's happening in Ukraine that John mentioned. Whether it was 9/11 or this war or Hurricane Katrina, or there's certain things that have happened where you're like, oh, I can't imagine it would have gone that way. Or, and I guess it's one of or the COVID, oh, can't believe we're 2 years into this. And,
Right.
There was a sense with all those things I just mentioned that we were in a bubble that got popped. You know what I mean? And that things that happened that actually we didn't really imagine that could happen. And so I think that what that means is that our imaginations actually are not large enough or creative enough to come up with some of these terrible things. And so therefore, maybe our imaginations aren't that creative enough by ourselves to come up with the grand vision of what does the kingdom of God look like, right? And so that's why we need each other, and that's why we need community, because the reality of it is the kingdom of God may be more grand than we actually can think of on our own, right? And even though we see glimpses of it in every day, we see glimpses and examples of what we know the kingdom is about, but it's still not here yet, because there's still work to be done to sort of grow that beloved community. And I just really believe that given what we read in Revelation, is that, a way to sort of unpack that is that when I imagine the intergenerational church, the multicultural church, the larger ecumenical church, people from all backgrounds with relationships with one another, that doesn't mean that they're all under one roof, but it means that we're all connected and we're all in relationship with one another and living like a community, where we're actually practicing radical hospitality, radical generosity, sharing, right? When my kids were little, I've got 3 children, and when they were little, we moved into a neighborhood that had a lot of families of the same age and children around the same age. And there were a number, Nancy, there were a number of social workers living in the neighborhood. And we started building relationships with one another. And what happened really quickly, and when I mean quickly, I mean within a couple of weeks, was a network map of where all the families with young children were living. And we started sharing clothes and helping each other out with food and figuring out who could cook what better, who could fix what in terms of the handy people in the neighborhood. And it happened really naturally. And then somebody asked the question, well, maybe we should actually create an Excel spreadsheet with all this stuff. And somebody did that, right? And the reality of it was, is it turned in to families just figuring out ways to support one another. And to me, that was an example of what I think any church should be able to try to figure out with itself, its members, and with the community that they're in relationship with. And if they've got goals to build relationships to strengthen the community, then that's something that you can do. And I think that if the church can figure out ways to do that within itself, within its members, then they can possibly imagine what that would be like to do that with people they don't know, with strangers. And so that's one way to think about it, is you can tell your members that you're experimenting with this kind of activity amongst yourselves, so that you actually can practice it, get some of the muscle strength to be able to do it with people that you don't know, or I should say, friends that will have in the future. You just haven't built that relationship yet, because I think there's always ways to discover how to build community, how to practice generosity, and how to offer hospitality. I just think that a lot of churches get into the habit of offering programs in a transactional way, where, they might be giving out money and grants and benevolence funds to groups, but do they really know the people? You're helping people with emergency payments on their heating or their electric bill, but do you actually know their story about why they got into that place to begin with? There was a church not too far down the road from where Andy's office is, Wilson Temple, Andy. It's an African American church, but it's a United Methodist church just down the road from the other white memorial, and they have a food pantry there at Wilson Temple, and it doesn't meet the criteria to actually be serviced by the food bank. So they actually will collect food from other neighborhood churches in that area and get volunteers from other churches to help with the food pantry. And so they get help from the other white memorial and the Friends Meeting House, which is down the street, and Fairmont United Methodist Church and West Raleigh Presbyterian and others. And they sparked the interest of the Interfaith Food Shuttle in Raleigh, who offered to make cooking classes happen at Wilson Temple. And so what was really interesting is that Interfaith Food Shuttle started offering these classes on how to cook, and the neighborhood, the folks living in the neighborhood would come, and the same ones that would come to the food pantry would come to these cooking classes. And there were some apartment complexes behind the church that people were living in that were coming to this. And somebody asked the question about, after the cooking classes had been going for a while, they asked them about, well, are you cooking these recipes at your house? And the answer was no, all across the board. And this is an example of one of these transactional programs, right? So here's why they weren't doing it. The food that they were getting from the food pantry was not the ingredients or the food that they were using in these recipes. That's one reason. The other reason was most of these folks lived in the apartment complexes, and they had microwaves and hot plates, but they didn't have pots and pans and utensils and stoves and the kinds of things they had in the church where they were actually doing the cooking. And so that's an example of a little bit of a miss, because what they weren't doing were building the kind of relationships with the neighbors to try to figure out, well, what kind of food programming should we be doing with the neighbors, right? they weren't asking the questions about like, well, what do you eat during the week? What do you eat that's different from what you're getting at the food pantry? They didn't ask about the equipment that they had or the setup they had at home to cook things. And that's honestly why sometimes community gardens sometimes misalign with their neighbors, because sometimes folks don't know actually how to cook the things that they're picking up from the community garden, as sad as that is. But I can honestly say, over the years, I've had a number of babysitters who didn't know how to boil water, and it's just because sometimes that's just not how they grew up, luckily they don't have to figure out how to cook cereal or they'd be in trouble, but the reality of it is,
This is
what you
another
got?
cool book, John, about when you were talking about relational. This book, 5 Loaves, 2 Fish, and 12 Volunteers. It's a book. It's called Growing a Relational Food Ministry by Elizabeth May McGill.
Okay.
That's been a really kind of eye-opening, eye-opening book to read too, in terms of any kind of relation. It doesn't have to be a food ministry, but it's about the dynamics of the relationship, and more about that than it is about a food ministry. She just uses food ministries as the way to just help you understand, this transactional versus, doing things in a way that you're talking about, which is finding out from the community what they have to offer, and then using the skills that they bring to the mix instead of you doing.
No, that's great.
People.
I'm going to look that book up because I don't know it. And like most of us that are faith leaders and involved with the church, we love a good book. It's just like, give it, I know people that'll drive an hour for a meeting just if they think they're going to get a free book out of it. John, did you have a question? You're on mute, brother.
If there's a moment.
Yeah, go ahead. What you got?
We've got a Monday, Thursday program planned in our church at Edenton.
Mm-hmm.
And I have friends at a Black Baptist church that's only a block or so away.
Yep.
And that's totally unfamiliar to them.
Yeah.
So with the consent of the powers that be, I reached out to the minister. He said, yeah, I'd like to come and I'll bring some of our folk. So we've got an interesting situation there potentially, particularly if folks will reach out, talk, ask questions that others can ask and explore. And then here's the kicker.
Yep.
They've just recently celebrated 150th anniversary of their church that started post-Civil War.
Yeah.
Well, most Caucasian churches have no idea what that mentality might be, given particularly the racial history of this country and particularly the Southeast.
Yes.
So I'm politely saying that's a way to follow up on what may be the introductory remarks on Monday, Thursday. So it's a simple thing to do, as it were, but yet very complex. And I would think I've heard different churches that are even smaller than we. One had only 8 members, but how many or how few you have, you can always invite someone in. You can always make it known that you are open to being invited into their backyard. And just these simple relational transactions, I think, can open some good possibilities. So I just share that with you.
No, I think that's great. There's a couple things that come to mind. It's like what I would really encourage anybody to do, and you could make it part of your Lenten journey, is that if you've got people that you want to build relationships with that you don't actually know, if they're comfortable given the pandemic, that is to break bread over lunch. So, I mean, I know you've got the Monday, Thursday program, but what are the relationships that can be built over the next number of weeks leading up to that, to where maybe they can help think through how that program might unfold, so that they're just not coming to your program, but that maybe there's ways to build that up together. And I guess an example I would give is, like, there are people who get nervous or anxious about building relationships across culture because they're not sure how to act or be with one another. They're not as comfortable. And it was this was a while back. This was before the pandemic, but there was an Episcopal church initiative to try to work down east, and we had a gathering in Wilson, and this was primarily a group of all Episcopalians and one rogue Presbyterian. Actually, it was not in Wilson. We might have been in Rocky Mount. No, we were in Tarboro. Benjamin Kane. He was at
Tarboro.
That's Tarboro. Ben was our rogue Presbyterian that showed up to this Episcopal meeting, and we were talking about building relationships across class and culture and whatnot. And there was an elder layperson from one of the Episcopal churches, and he actually asked the question. He said, "How do you ask an African American to come to a meeting?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I'm not sure how to invite someone." I said, "Well, you could always do it over lunch." And he said, "Well, what would we talk about?" And I said, I was being serious, but I had a little bit of a sarcastic tone. I said, "Well, maybe you could talk about Jesus." And he looked at me and said, "Were you joking or were you serious?" I said, "Well, it was a little bit of both." And I said, "If you're both in ministry together, why not talk about scripture? Why not talk about Jesus? Why not talk about the things that you've done and just compare notes?" And there was so much anxiety in the room about how to build relationships across race. But here was something that was interesting. We decided to gather again in about 6 or 7 months in a different town, and we met in Williamston. And we met just a month after the shooting at Mother Emanuel in Charleston. And given the fact that the first meeting we had was almost exclusively white, I worked really hard to reach out to some friends of mine in some of the AMEZ, CME, AME Zion churches, and some others, and got to the point that the meeting we had in Williamston was about 50-50 African American and 50% white, mostly Episcopalians in the white part, but a few Presbyterians and Methodists. And we had a really good discussion. And here was the thing. People were so upset from both the shooting at Mother Emanuel and the way that Dylan Roof was treated by the police in such a careful way, that frustration, anxiety, and the shock that had happened, it broke through some of the anxiety that had existed in the earlier meeting, and the relationships were built right there because everybody was in the same room together, right? And we were having a discussion and having a common experience of actually talking through issues of race, issues of poverty, and what we can do to strengthen the church community in Eastern North Carolina. And it was a pretty amazing meeting. And of course, it went much longer than was scheduled because people were really into the meeting. They didn't want to leave. And so I would just raise that sometimes that stress of some of these external forces and happenings out in the world, can actually provide a little bit of a reference point for some really important discussions. But I applaud you for the Monday Thursday program. There's and I'm looking at the time, but I'll just mention that there was a group down in Wadesboro in Anson County that had developed a little bit of an interdenominational committee that has existed for years. And there was a new Methodist pastor that moved in there, and the Presbyterian pastor that's down there was already actively involved. But if you looked at who was involved in that ministerial alliance, it was ecumenical, but it was all white. And they decided that after being in existence for 20 years, that they were going to close down the network and start new in some kind of way. But they were only going to start new if 50% of the people in the network were churches of color. And so they gave me a call and asked me about process. And I applauded them for going ahead and making the decision to close down the network and start anew and not use the old name, right? They were going to create a new name. And I encouraged them not to create a name yet until they have built the relationships with the other churches. And so they're actually using the Lenten season to actually build those relationships. And so each one of the churches has agreed to build a relationship with another church, but a church of color. And with the idea that the 5 churches will become 10 churches. And once they have 10 churches that are half churches of color, and I say of color because one of the churches is building a relationship with a Hispanic church, and the other churches are going to be African American, that once they've all kind of had lunch together as a whole, but they're going to start just two and two, people building relationships one-on-one, and then eventually all 10, and they're going to start a new church network with a new name. And I end with that story because sometimes this asset mapping process gets a little bit of a critique of not really dealing with race or culture. And I would just simply say that if your intentions and your questions are about working across race and culture, then you're actually dealing with it, right? Because you're actually on the path of building those relationships across race and culture that that may not exist at this particular time. I'm not saying that that's the number one thing to deal with, but I do think that as you're thinking about how the church grows, and not your individual congregation, but all church as a whole, I do think it's important to figure out areas of common ground that can benefit the whole community. And so the kinds of work that you're talking about around youth, and the kind of work that you're talking about in terms of building relationships to care for some of our more vulnerable populations, whether they are people who are just down on their luck temporarily or who have struggled for some time, it's just really important.
And we have talked about the fact that it's about 30 churches who contribute at one level or another, and a smaller group that's very involved. But we talked about the fact that if we had spent any of our time trying to decide what our theology was, we would still be 12 years later stumbling around with that. All we said was, we have a common goal to take care of people in need.
Yeah.
And we just get around the theological differences. And
yeah,
race doesn't seem to be an issue. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's interesting. It's like, I was baptized in a UCC church, but my mother's side of the family was most exclusively Methodist. And I don't think I understood anything about the differences in the Protestant denominations until I was much older. And it didn't occur to me that there were theological differences until I got old enough to understand that there were differences in theology, right? And it was really interesting to me to all of a sudden recognize that just because mainline churches are all Protestant, they don't all do the same thing. But it's like I think I told Andy, I've been telling everybody, my oldest child is 18 and she moved away this past fall, and her faith has actually been stronger and her church participation has been stronger since she left home. And part of that has to do with the fact that I think she's connecting more with her roots and kind of our family. And it's just been interesting to sort of witness that, because that goes against the stereotype in some ways of people once they leave home. But honestly, the reality of it is I could hang out with y'all and talk about this as long as y'all would hang out, but I want to honor your time. I think we were supposed to go to 8:30, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that there's anything else that y'all might want to talk about. I do want to say again that I'm going to create a resource list, share it with y'all. I'm probably going to share it with Andy as a Google Doc. Maybe he could share it with y'all as a Google Doc, and y'all can add to it, like the books that y'all have referenced tonight that I think would make sure it'd be good that everybody knows it. It seemed like every book that was mentioned, Mary's already read, but we'll just we want to make sure that everybody's knows about the good books that exist. And then honestly, one of the reasons I kind of like Google Docs is that if you have a question that you think about tomorrow or next week, that you can actually maybe put it in the Google Doc and we can all respond to the questions that y'all might have, because that's one way of doing things at a distance. But if I will also include my contact information in the chat in just a minute, and we'll include it in the resource document, because I would welcome an invitation to come see y'all, because one of my talents and gifts is inheriting my father's love to drive long distances. And so I would be happy anytime. John, I'll even come all the way out to Edenton, because I just
have a valid passport.
There's nothing I love better than that little that water that you've got right out there, and that little park right there on the Sound is a beautiful little place to be quiet on.
From time to time, we walk on it.
You're funny. Well, I'm going to go ahead while y'all are thinking up if you have anything else you want to ask or talk about. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. Feel free to, oh shoot, I hit enter already without even putting in my phone number or anything.
We know your name.
Yeah, we got my name. There's a phone number. And one reason I use my full name is because there are a few John Parkers out there, and Dempsey is a family name. My grandfather's name was Dempsey, and my great-grandfather's name was John. And so that's why my father named me John Dempsey Parker, but it's also my email and it's also my website. So it just makes things easier that way.
And as John said, we will make sure that you get all of this, all of the resources he mentioned, and have his contact info, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any other last minute thoughts or questions?
This has been a joy.
Thank you.
Well, there's I always say that one thing that the faith community is really good at is recognizing the fact that there are things that we have to lament. You know, there are things in the world that we're not happy about. There are things that we wish that were different, and there's probably things in our own lives and our own families that we wish were not the way they are. But the reality of it is that they're in the church, in the life of the church, there's always something to grieve, right? But the reality of it is that through a process like this asset mapping, hopefully that you can still see the abundance that exists all around us, and recognize that even if we have 1 foot in grief, that we actually should have 1 foot in joy, in the fact that the fruitfulness exists. And sometimes I think church folk particularly try to make things more complicated than they need to. And that
Really?
yeah. And that, I mean, when I think about, the fruit of the Spirit, sometimes we gloss over and bypass all of the Sunday school stuff that actually was really good. And the reality of it is if we just take the fruit of the Spirit and really think about that, not as just things that are flowery and soft, but if we actually recognize that each one of those fruits is actually a body of work and actually a practice and something that we should actually grow in an intentional and a serious way, then, I mean, that in and of itself is asset-based community development. If you're constantly thinking about ways to strengthen and grow love and kindness and patience and self-control, all these things, it's not just a list, right? It's actually a work and a practice, each one of those. And we could say the same thing about the Sermon on the Mount. And we all know that there's many of us that can say the Lord's Prayer in our sleep, and that there are people in our pews that will stand up and say the Lord's Prayer fully awake and yet asleep, because they're actually not paying attention to what the words actually mean, because they're just on autopilot, or they're thinking about what they're going to have for lunch, or they're going to get at the grocery store. And the reality of it is, even the Lord's Prayer is an example of something that can be used as a study guide for not only the church, but for the same kind of process that we're talking about. And so my plea to y'all is to almost like, even as we're coming out of the sleep and the hibernation, Mary, that we do what we can to remember that the church can tell that story, and that the story is as a path, and that it's an opportunity to connect and build relationship and community, and again, generosity, hospitality, and hopefully all on a path of deepening our discipleship. So I just appreciate y'all coming tonight, and I hope you will talk with others who were not here about what we talked about, and don't be shy in reaching out if you want to talk about what we've talked about tonight further in your own context. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Great to see all of you. And is there any objection if we post the whole video of this on YouTube so people can see it? All right, we will do that. I know y'all have told some good stories, but I think they are just as relevant as all of this. So thank you, John. Thank you all for being here.
I appreciate it.
And
I'll
have
be
a
in
great
touch.
evening, and we'll keep in touch.
Right.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.